Hey, what is up? This is Jake with Exodus. This video version of our podcast, Trail Cam Radio, is all about static and dynamic sets. And it's a very interesting topic for anyone that is trying to get the most out of their dollars and buy the right camera for what they're trying to use it for. We dive into all of that. And also, this was done around like episode 5 or 6, so a lot has changed since 2018 when we first recorded a video about this topic. And so now we cover a lot about cell cameras in this one as well. So we hope you guys enjoy. If you do, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe. Now let's get into it.
Lights,
camera,
follow the trail.
ready to shoot.
If you know where a deer's bedding and you know where he's eating, that deer should be dead.
Camera!
If you're passive on a deer, what you're doing is you're teaching them.
I've got $30 in the Michigan record book. Everyone but one has had at least one previous wound on his body. Some had as many as 4.
Trail Cam Radio from the guys at Exodus.
All right, we're live, and this first podcast episode, aside from a new project that should be out, well, maybe not. Got to see. We recorded a couple multi-purpose pieces of content here, but this is the first Trail Cam Radio episode in our new office, new studio set, new everything. So if you're watching this on YouTube, you notice that's a little bit of an upgrade from the past. And yeah, here we are.
Yeah, feels good, finally.
Yeah, you guys have done a really great job of making this place a home, whatever they say. So yeah, that's awesome. So what we wanted to do is we have a working spreadsheet, to be completely honest, on what we want to talk about for the year. And we discussed this earlier, and it's like, man, all the way back from episode like 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, a lot has changed since those episodes.
The dynamic of the show has gotten better. We've become better speakers.
Everything is improved. We have a lot larger audience that tunes into this.
Much larger audience now.
We have solidified ourselves as a trail camera podcast.
Podcast, a wilderness podcast in general. I mean,
according to the charts.
Yeah.
According to the charts. So this is one of these. We're going to be going back and revisiting some of those initial episodes that had great information, very important, but a little bit dated, and we want to get another crack at it, especially for folks that maybe haven't gone back into our catalog all the way. And I mean, if you haven't done so, there's a lot of good stuff in there.
Yeah.
So check that out, but we understand that that's not where most people are going to catch those episodes. So this is a rehash, a redo, a mulligan of static and dynamic sets for trail cameras. This is something that you've coined yourself, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I coined those terms.
Yeah. Not trademark for something. No, these are your terms. And so, you just ready to dive right into it?
Yeah. We talked to a lot of people about marketing terms and like those made up things. Just to clarify, like these aren't, this is not a marketing term, but when you're looking at like product development, there's always you're always trying to gain in one area and then you may have to give something up in another to optimize the specific or best ideal use case or best product for a specific use case. And that's really where those terms came from. There was, after we had built one camera, we got feedback from that, launched a second camera, and there were so many people just in love with the brand. They love the products, but they maybe only run cameras on a bait pile, and they don't need all the bells and whistles.
Our flagship model.
Yeah, whether they didn't want to spend the money or they didn't need all the features in that camera, they wanted something more basic. And that's where if you're running cameras on bait stations or mineral sites or a feeder, that's much more of a static area. Like you can control it, you can manipulate it. So that's where the static and dynamic.
How did you think of those terms? Were they just in conversation and you're like, oh yeah, that makes sense?
I talk to myself a lot when I'm driving, like a lot.
Like out loud?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I have memos on this phone, a lot. There's some short film stuff on here, like different ideas and so that's where that stuff comes from, really. And whatever, you can laugh, make fun of me. I know you always hear the story of tinkers or inventors or business guys carrying around a little tablet or notebook, writing stuff down throughout the day.
Or people having a notepad next to their bed. They wake up from a dream or in the middle of the night. They got to jot it down before they forget.
Yeah, you always hear those stories. And I'm not organized enough really to carry around so I just put it in my phone.
So that's okay. So that's how that came to fruition.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay. So really the purpose of this is for someone listening to this to figure out what's the difference between a static and dynamic set, and also maybe what kind of camera should you be looking at, what features should you be looking at, and to where you should allocate those dollars to really still have a good experience, but also keep the most amount of money in your pocket, which is important.
Right. Yeah.
So let's dive right into static. What is this is your baby, so static. Let's dive into what a static set is, and break down this entire piece of this. We've gotten so much better at the podcast here. Forgetting what I'm saying. Let's go ahead and dive right into what exactly what your camera settings should be, camera choice, and all those different things.
Yeah, just to build off a little bit, when I was describing a static set or a static environment a little bit earlier, it's just an area where deer are going to spend a certain amount of time. So it's not a trail. They're not just passing through that area. They're going to spend a little bit of time there. And it's an area where you can basically put the deer where you want them in relation to the camera. So, again, we use the example of a feeder or a mineral station or a bait site. Like, you can physically almost hang your camera first and then go in and build that manipulation or put that feeder in place or put that bait station in place to put the deer where you want them. And once you get that set up, there might be you need to tweak things a little bit. Maybe you're moving your camera, maybe moving the bait pile or feeder a little bit because deer are using different trails or whatever the case may be. But that stuff evolves a little bit over time. But essentially, that's a static environment is a controlled area where the animal is going to spend a lot amount of time, and you can basically put them in a close proximity to your camera. That's the idea behind it.
Sure. Okay, so let's creator mode. You get to create the perfect textbook static environment set. What does that look like? How far is the point of interest from the camera? Mm-hmm. What part of the frame is that
Don't
point of
ask me too many
interest?
questions at once.
Okay, so we'll do number one. Perfect distance for a static set. Generally speaking.
20 to 25 feet. Now, that can change depending on what you have in the background. That's one of the things we talk about nighttime images. When you have something that's retroreflective in the background that can shine that light back to the camera, it's going to increase.
Brighter night pictures.
Yes, it's going to make brighter nighttime pictures. So there's a little bit of photography that comes into play. If you're out in an open field, those nighttime pictures are going to be darker, so that distance might shrink a little bit. But the general rule is 20 to 25 feet, where that camera's far enough away from that point of interest where it's not going to be noticed. So you're still going through the spook equation things that we talk about, the height, the diameter of the tree, the paracord, the strap, all that stuff. But a rule of thumb, 20 to 25 feet.
20 to 25 feet. Next question I have, where would you want to frame that point of interest in terms of the picture of the camera or an association? Is it directly in front of it? Is it off to a third? Is it off to a quarter? What does that look like?
I don't like when I do this, and we've done this on corn piles here in Ohio, I don't necessarily like to have that dead center in frame. I think moving it a third is too much because, again, you should be able to control where these deer are coming, whether you have to hinge cut something or whatever to block one side of that bait station or one side of that feeder. You can make them come from the other side. So if you're going to frame it up in a third, make sure that you can do that, because if you get too far over, you're going to end up with half deer pictures or maybe some butt pictures or half rack pictures if if those areas are framed over too far in 1/3 or 1/4. So I don't necessarily like the half, but somewhere between a half and a third, basically.
That makes sense.
Is what I like.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. Okay, so talk about camera height. I know we've talked about this a lot, but maybe there's someone listening to this type of content for the first time. Mm-hmm. What is the ideal height for a static set where it's going to be 20, 25 feet, it's not dead center? What does that height look like in a perfect set?
You can do a couple different things here, and this is really with static sets. Now, guys talk about hanging their cameras 10, 12 feet high to get them out of the line of sight of people because they're worried about theft or they're worried about animals. But what that does is it really limits your detection because that camera's pointed down. Mm-hmm. If it's 12 feet up in the air and if you have it angled at a 45, you're at a 1-to-1 and you're only getting 12 feet plus you have a void underneath the tree or underneath the camera, mm-hmm. Right next to the tree. But in a static set, you can manipulate that because you're only monitoring a small area. So you're able to get your cameras up higher if that's something that you're worried about. But in general, I like eye level. Like eye level for a human, like 5.5, 6.5, 7, 8 feet, somewhere in that. And it depends on the tree, I guess, but somewhere not lower than 5.5, 6 feet. I should say 6 feet, not lower than 6 feet. So somewhere between 6 to 8 feet, slight angle. You can get that framed up, and it's above the deer. They seem like they don't notice it as much, and it's still, if you're worried about human intrusion or human theft, I guess it's still up more than what a traditional 4 foot, 4.5.
People are trained to look at that waist high level on trees on an edge for sure.
Right.
Okay, so you've placed this, for example, mineral station or mineral site. You have it 20, 25 feet away from that. You have it not dead center. You have it 6 foot high, 6 feet high. Okay, if you're doing this on your property, what would be access? Are you considering access as you're building this entire static?
That should be your first thing, because you're, like I said, your camera location should be, you should almost have that picked out first. And obviously with that, access is part of it. But when you're looking at static, depending on what your static environment is, if it's something you're going in and manipulating, like food, like whether it's mineral or corn pile or feeder, like you're going in there anyways to provide that. Like you got to dump corn in the ground, you got to go fill your feeder, you got to put mineral on the ground. So from that side of things, it's a little less human footprint. I guess there's a little bit less of a worry there for human footprint at that location. But the access comes into play. Like, where is that in relation to, like, maybe bedding on your property? The predominant wind, like when you're going in to check that camera, is the wind blowing into that bedding area to let everything know that you're there. So those are the things when you're talking about access, not necessarily the amount of footprint that you're leaving at that specific site, but what you're doing to the rest of the property.
Yeah, in association to the rest of the property.
Right.
Okay, so then let's dive into what are some good camera settings for this? I mean, camera settings are something that I think people glaze over, and I think I would love to know the data on how many people just leave the presets, and then how many people actually go in and like fine tune it for their set perfectly. What is it? What is some words of wisdom on this?
Well, in a static set, because those deer are going to spend a lot of time there, you're probably going to want to run a longer trigger delay. You're probably not going to want to run a super high burst. So for me, most of the time in a static set, it's about inventory. So I'm typically running that in photo mode. Usually on a 2, maybe a 3-shot burst. Only a 3-shot burst if I know there's a deer of interest and I really want to go get a good look at him.
Does he have a split or a kick? Like those
if it's
type
a
of
big
pictures?
deer, a deer I really have interest in, then I'll use a 3-shot burst, but usually 2, and I'm running somewhere around a 30-second delay, maybe even longer, maybe even to a minute, depending on the time of year and what that static environment is. Like if it's a corn pile, it's probably going to be a minute.
Okay, so then what about what are some of the data that you're trying to be acquiring from this? Obviously, it's not, in my experience, it's not, well, I can't use bait piles or anything but I can use, destination food plots with a hot corner, which would be similar, but what kind of data are you trying to acquire from this? What is the purpose of this set?
Most of it is inventory, like what we just talked about. So if it's, through the summer months on minerals, it's monitoring velvet growth, trying to have an idea of doe fawns or fawns, what that health looks like. And then through the fall, that really kind of changes, because with these, we hunt, when in Ohio, we mostly do this with corn and mineral. So it's not that we're necessarily hunting over those locations, especially on minerals in the fall.
Right.
But occasionally we will hunt close to corn in the fall if deer are showing up, but it's more towards the late season. But one of the things that we've noticed with these static sets on a property is with these corn, like rubs just start popping up out of nowhere, because these does are spending so much time on that in the corn, like out of nowhere, where this property doesn't hold any bucks, and there's never been any rut sign or activity in that area, because all these does are coming into that bait pile. There's freaking rubs popping up everywhere. So keeping tabs on that through the rut is, I guess, non-core bucks coming in, neighborhood, like the surprise bucks coming through your property. And if you're able to capitalize on that, then you have a couple of days to get on that piece and hunt. Maybe it's not on the corn pile or on that static location, but it's somewhere on that piece of property.
Or log it for years to come too, which we've talked about a ton.
Yes, and annual data. So, and then going into to late season, it kind of goes back to what you were doing in the summer, trying to inventory bucks, trying to inventory the
who survived, who do we draw, and
yeah, exactly. So it kind of shifts between through the summer months, early season, rut, and then late season or postseason.
I agree. Going into what are some camera choices? Obviously, we built the Trek for this set almost solely. But what are some key features? Obviously, sometimes the Trek's in stock, sometimes it's not. So what are some why is the Trek good for static sets?
Well, ideally you want something. Now, again, this is where like the budget stuff comes into play, because you don't want to overpay for features that you're not going to use. If you're using cameras majority of the time in static sets, there's no reason to buy a camera that has a 1 second recovery time or some crazy, a bunch of crazy other features. Like even the viewing screen, it's nice to use on a Lift 2, but in a static set, you're putting those deer where you want them.
Yep.
So, features like that aren't necessarily a smart investment if that's the way you're running your camera. So you want to look at what's the bare bones. So I need something that works consistently. I need something I can strap to the tree, and regardless of what that static set is, it's going to take pictures. So it's got to be reliable. It's got to have good battery life, because the thing's going to take a lot of pictures over bait, over feeders, over minerals. Like you're going to get a lot more pictures there than you would running them on a trail. So it has to have good battery life. And then you need, I guess, the customizable features to make it work inside of your use case. You can get away with a longer recovery time. And if you don't know what recovery time is, that's different than your trigger delay. The recovery time is the amount of time your camera takes after it snaps a picture, writes it to a card, to become active again, to take another picture. So again, if you had a camera with a 1 second recovery time like the Lift 2, you don't necessarily need that, because you're going to run a long trigger delay anyways. In a static set, if you have a 30-second trigger delay, you don't need a 1 second recovery time. You can get away with something that has 10 seconds, 5 seconds, or even 15, 20 seconds. Now, most cameras in today's marketplace are faster than that. Like the Trek is 5 seconds, but you don't need something that's super, super fast if you're going to run those longer trigger delays.
And longer videos too,
and yes.
Which we suggest.
Yeah.
Okay. So anything else that you want to cover with the static? I mean, we broke down the perfect set on how, what is the perfect ideal situation for a static setting. We broke down the settings. We broke down why you can save a little bit more money on some of these use cases. Anything else?
Nothing is popping in my mind right off the rip. What I would say is, a lot of guys with the cell cameras becoming more popular. There's a lot of guys that are gearing and running solely cell cameras, and they're still using them in dynamic ways and static ways. So again, when you compare SD card cameras, not every cellular camera has the same specifications. There's a big gap between the commodity cameras that are sold for $100 and us and Spartan that are sold for $300 or $400. And there's a big gap there between performance. So keep that in mind too. Just because the pictures are going to your phone, it doesn't mean that all those specifications are the same between wireless or connected devices.
That's a great point. So, okay, nothing else for static. Well, actually, let me ask you this: what's your best static set that you've had in the past? So, when you think of a static set, this is the place. Whether it was because it was extremely efficient, or because you had some big deer show up too.
Well, Northeast Ohio, there are no big deer. So,
that's your resolution: shaking people off your trail. No one knows if you're telling the truth or not now.
That's true.
I know
but
you're telling
really
the truth.
Is not any big deer. Not at least not my properties. I mean, there's some 30s and 40s running around on different pockets, but nothing I have access to. I think the best. Personally, I like summertime static sets with minerals, because I like to see the potential what these deer are getting into. knowing like, hey, this is a stud 3-year-old or a stud 2-year-old, and then I guess building the anticipation for him to shed velvet. So I really like mineral sets, and that's my personal opinion. Which we really only have one set over on my dad's place that we have had a mineral site there for I don't know, probably 6 or 7 years now. Probably it's big
crater,
divot in the ground. That's one that pops into my mind.
Gotcha. I know the purpose of static sets aren't necessarily this, but on those static sets, I like to use video. I like to use video every chance I can get. And I understand having, the longer trigger delay and all those logistics. But when it is a focused area, you can get a really good idea what exactly that deer looks like.
Oh, yeah.
Versus just, a handful of pictures and you're like trying to like figure out, like, you can see how big his body really is. Like, is there sway in it? Like, you just get so much more information.
Yeah, that's where, like, if you have a specific deer of interest or a big deer and you want to get some information or just cool B-roll or cool video of them, it changes those settings a little bit. Even like through the fall, if last year a deer showed up in a certain area and you have a camera in a static set and you're anticipating him showing up this year, like you would probably increase the burst count and you'd probably shorten your trigger delay to make sure you're not missing something. Like that's everybody's worry. Like, well, I don't want to run a long trigger delay because I don't want to miss that one picture or I don't want to miss that one buck. But at the end of the day, like he's probably going to be there more than once.
Yeah,
probably.
I would agree. Yeah. There's just one example too. This was not a static set, but it's just interesting how we talk about extending the video length. So this was the coveted November 3rd day. It's my favorite day of the year. And this particular, it was a situation where a doe, it's on a fence. There's a fence line comes down to a corner, and they used to run cattle on this farm a gazillion years ago. So there's really a very defined choke point. Tall grass, warm seed grasses, cornfield. Doe triggers the camera running, and about 15 seconds later, 20 seconds later, because I had it running on 30 seconds, here comes a mega trailing that doe. And I don't necessarily think, too, because the doe she was running. So the doe was not really, I call her like back tail is what triggered it. And then the buck was coming from, of course, I had another camera on the other corner, so I can verify all this.
Angles,
yeah, so I can verify this, but that's just an example of running video and like the anomaly of like that one time. Like you can figure out that one time maybe isn't as much, especially when you start running those longer videos. That's my point on that.
Yeah, and to your point, you need, like, when you hang trail cameras in general, the way you run them in the summer and the settings you run them in summer versus the season, and as you shift into the rut, and even how often you check them, like that, it all changes. And that's why we do that trail camera checklist and I guess the strategy advice or tips or tactics and everything that we cover is because that stuff it changes every couple months. Mm-hmm. And if you're not ahead of the game, like if you're a week late,
it could be the world of difference.
100%.
Could change your whole season.
Yes.
Realistically. I had another thought. And it has escaped me for this moment. Oh, okay. What would you consider a mock scrape? Would you consider that, are you going to need a static camera on that or a dynamic? Or if you could afford a dynamic type camera, would it be worth it?
I think scrape areas are static because it's 100% like a mock scrape because you're physically putting that in place. But even a natural scrape, community scrape, I think that is a static set. However, typically I'm using a dynamic camera in those sets. So it's kind of like a hybrid, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. If I was, our situation is a little bit different too, like in terms of having the resources to run a bunch of dynamic type cameras over scrapes. So that's part of what we need to do for what we do here. But yeah, I would agree. I think you can get away with running the static type camera on mock scrape for sure all day. But what you're going to learn on video mode or with a dynamic type camera, it may be worth upgrading on that specific scenario on a mock scrape.
Yeah, and there's added things to learn there, like about a deer's body language,
how they behave.
Yeah, top to bottom. I think there's more information to gather on a scrape than a corn pile or a mineral site. So,
and they're way cooler.
Yeah.
So okay, going into the next one, let's dive into dynamic sets. What the heck does that mean?
So again, it's kind of the exact opposite of static. Dynamic is something like when you think about the word dynamic, it's like moving or fluid. There's a lot of parts and pieces to it.
Complex.
Complex, exactly. So a dynamic set is something where you cannot dictate the amount of time a deer is spending in that area, and the established pattern or movement is already there. So you can't put deer where you can't manipulate that movement from a certain direction. I mean, you can hinge cut and do things to make them use different trails or whatever, but a lot of times deer might not use that trail, use a secondary trail or whatnot. So dynamic set is a trail. It's maybe an ag field where you necessarily might not know where the deer is spending the majority of his time, like in a food plot.
Not a feathered edge,
right?
Or yeah,
right. So food plot, ag field, trail. Like we said, a scrape is kind of a hybrid. It kind of falls into both categories basically. Bedding areas are dynamic, so all of that fits the dynamic environments or dynamic sets.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Did you mention topography features at all in terms of dynamic sets as well?
I did not, but that would, yeah. So like pinch points, funnels, saddles, benches, things where deer are moving through would be a dynamic environment.
Do you have any specific example? Let me start. I do have a specific example on a dynamic set. This farm is long gone. I no longer have permission to hunt it, but it's the one where that giant 8-point would show up every single year, and it was up on top of a tree, and it was just a trail with multiple converging spots. It pinched down. They could be coming from this direction, or they could be coming, walking towards the camera or walking away. And that camera produced more big deer than that set produced more big deer than any other camera ever.
Yeah.
And that's a situation where they could really be walking anywhere. It's pinched down. But if you weren't running on video and you didn't have those settings right, you would not have the same results.
Yeah. And placement, how you angle that camera is a big factor of like where and how that thing's going to be triggered.
How to frame it, make sure that
make
sure that it's not up too high. Like I've mistakenly put cameras up too high and too tight to the trail that they're going to be doing, and it's just not a good experience.
You get that void, yeah.
Yeah, you get the void, or you just get a clip of them, and that's not the camera's fault. It's user operator error there.
Right.
And that's, I think, the key of dynamic sets is having a camera with a screen on it too, which is the Lift 2 and the render as well.
Yeah. Quick hack: if you do have a dynamic camera, as far as settings like the recovery time, you want that fast recovery time, you want the customizable features. If it does not have a screen, one of the things that we've came up with, and I can't remember if
the first place I ever saw it was Jake Bush on Instagram. That's the first place I ever saw it.
Huh? No, I can't remember.
It's where you put this camera on selfie mode right in front of the lens.
Yeah, I can't remember who came up with that, but maybe it was me. I don't know. Whatever. But if you flip your cell phone around and put it in selfie mode and just kind of eyeball,
it's pretty cool.
Match up the lens. It's not exact because the field of view of the camera is going to be different than what your cell phone is. But if you look center to center in height wise, it gives you a rough idea of how that camera's framed.
Yeah, it's a great tip. It saves you that one month soak of heartache when you come back and you're like, wow, it was not pointed exactly where I thought, and everyone's done it.
But back to your topography example, like saddles. We run a lot of cameras on ridge tops for inventory purposes, and saddles. A lot of times, everybody thinks that this is just from us running so many cameras. Everybody thinks that deer are just constantly using saddles like perpendicular, so they're coming through that lowest point just crossing the ridge. But a lot of times what we see is deer's like cutting across or quartering into or quartering away from, and they're using you're using that saddle primarily probably based on the wind, but they're using that at a lot of different angles. So that's another example where it's not necessarily several trails converging, but that topography features pinching deer down to a certain area, but they're still using several different ways to navigate that.
Yeah, it's just a less controlled environment, and you need more ability with your camera is what it kind of boils down to. So, okay, so what about someone's thinking like, okay, topography, they're trying to think through on their farms that they hunt or the pieces of public that they have. What are some words of wisdom on actually putting these cameras in the best location for the least amount of negative impact?
Best location for the least amount of negative impact on your property.
Yeah, for what you're trying to do is kill a big deer.
So they would be, again, it probably shifts throughout the season, but you want to be able to look at whether it's trails, bedding areas, scrapes, food plots, ag fields. Like, you got to consider access based on the wind and what it's going to do to your scent while you're checking those cameras. If you're using cell cameras, it's a totally different world where you don't really have to worry about that. But to make the least amount of impact, I think that's probably at food locations away from bedding, putting them on edges of ag fields or edges of food plots where you're still gathering inventory data or data on how they're moving or accessing what time, like how they're moving with what wind direction to those food sources. And because they're so far away from bedding, there's less worry there of going in and causing a negative reaction to going in and checking that camera.
Got it. Okay, well, what about how you're actually setting these cameras up? So we have a video on our channel that dives into this a little bit more to what I'm trying to allude to, but okay, it's a dynamic set. You're setting it up on a trail or a converging spot. Do you want the camera pointing directly to where the deer are walking, or like walking directly to the camera? I mean, there's a lot of misconceptions there. What is the right way to set it up?
So that's one of the things we've talked about in the past. We have a short, like a vlog style video on this that we did in the field. And a lot of guys think, they have this trail coming through their property and they want to monitor as much of that trail as possible. So they put the camera where it's facing directly down that trail. So the deer are walking directly to or directly away from that camera. And they're doing that thinking they're helping themselves. But in reality, that is the worst thing you can do with any camera that runs on a dual element PIR sensor, which is
almost all
basically everything available. So the way a PIR sensor works with those two elements, they read the infrared radiation of that environment, and the camera's only going to trigger when there's a change between one element and the next. So when you have something walking directly in line with that camera and that sensor, both those elements are going to have the same reading until that animal is right in front of really, really close to that sensor. So, that's the absolutely worst thing you can possibly do. Ideally, you want to get that perpendicular, or if you're worried about, maybe not having that camera in the right spot and you want to cover more of the trail, you can quarter that to where they're walking at like a 45-degree angle.
Cheat it a little bit, yeah.
And coming across that field of view or that detection area. But mounting them parallel it's the worst thing you can do.
So that is the number one no-go.
Yes, 100%.
When it comes to dynamic sets.
100%.
Okay. Do you have any specific? Well, actually, that card pull you just did in the down yonder. It was a scrape or a community scrape, but it acted as a dynamic camera with great effect because, man, I guess the
trying not to give it away. Yeah.
No, I'm just saying, like, the rule of thumb here is like, yeah, man, unless it's over a bait pile or over a feeder or something like that, the dynamic just does so much more work, because if that was set up with a static camera, I don't think you would have got everything that you did.
So the scenario or the day that you're talking about, there's two different cards that I pulled there. One was on a community scrape or a primary scrape where there's just all kinds of chasing activity, and it's in an area where there's really, really harsh or aggressive topography. So even when that movement is kind of pinched down or focused in a more tight area, it's still coming from a bunch of different directions. And at the end of the day, like, deer navigate things way, what am I trying to say here? Things that we don't think deer will do.
They move with greater variation than what you think.
Yes, and they can navigate things
you wouldn't think.
Steep.
Yeah, it's insane.
Yes, it is 100%. I've seen that with my own eyes this year during the rut. But so that community scrape is an example, but also the camera that I had over on a trail that was wrapping around a bowl is another example of that, because a doe fawn came through and then a buck, mega giant, all in the same. I mean, there was minutes between, a couple minutes in between each deer. But if you had, a static camera with a longer trigger delay set up and a longer recovery time, like, there's a chance that you would miss one or two of those pictures, and two of them were slammers. So that's just another example of, if you had a static camera in that scenario, like it's just not going to perform as well.
So we've kind of talked about it a little bit, but what are some of these camera settings for the ideal dynamic camera? And for me, it's pretty much every Lift 2 I have is on video mode, and most times, especially during season, it's 35 seconds long, and really not with that much. I'm not as concerned with the trigger delay in between. I mean, obviously you're going to get one of them had a tree fall down and it was just a son of a gun and triggered nonstop, but that's the outlier. I guess for me, my dynamic sets are probably 30 to 35 seconds long on a video mode with a trigger delay of between 8 and 10 seconds, which is pretty quick in between, but I don't care. I'll flip through them. It doesn't bother me.
Yeah, I think like what you said with the video mode, that certainly helps. I think when you're looking at picture versus video, I think you need to ask yourself, how frequently am I going to come in and check
That's a big one of it, yeah.
Check this card? Because if your camera has the capacity of only, let's say it can only hold a 16 gig card, which that's not really true. Most are 32
Not
and
anymore,
above.
yeah.
Yep. So you can hold a lot of data on 32 gigs, but if you were setting that camera up for a year, like a lot of our stuff,
Not what you want to do.
and if you had it in video mode, like it's only going to run for maybe a couple months, and then the card's going to be filled. So if you're not going to get back to that area and check that camera, you probably don't want to leave it in video mode for that purpose. If you have access to it, then yeah, you 100% run video mode.
Okay, so what would we talk about putting cameras out all the time to scout for the next year.
Yeah.
What would be a dynamic set where you would have a camera set up in a dynamic environment for annual data? Because for most of me, those are going to be scrapes, which is static for the most part.
Yep. It could be scrapes, but bedding.
True.
Like if you want to monitor rutting activity and what bucks are coming, like what non-core bucks are coming into your property during the rut, because you're probably going to have a 3-day window there, running them in doe bedding areas or downwind sides of doe bedding areas, trails to doe bedding areas, and even some food sources during the later part of October all the way through November would all fall in that category for annual data for next year inside of a dynamic set.
Actually, I had a question jotted down too. So on a static set, whether it's a mock scrape or a feeder or something, have you used a dynamic set downwind at the predominant wind for the area of that static set to see what's going on?
With scrapes, yeah, we've done that with scrapes, but not on bait sites or mineral sites.
What was your experience? Like that. I haven't done this.
Well, in the big woods, if like a certain scenario where there was a scrape on a bench and then there was another bench below it, whether or not those deer would use thermals to kind of scent check that scrape and then J-hook into that scrape, knowing that a buck or a doe or whatever, something was there in the days prior. So that's something we were trying to watch, or how many deer actually walked past that static set, which would be a scrape, and had no interest in it. So I guess for us, it's more trying to figure out how they're using that in certain wind directions and certain thermals to kind of get a better picture or a better idea of actually how many deer are traveling through that area.
Where do you put the value of some of these? I mean, obviously, cameras are built to give you data and help you learn about the deer that you're hunting.
Yeah.
How do some of these, like in terms of travel patterns, feeding patterns, bedding patterns, how are dynamic sets valuable?
Well, I think they're more valuable in hunting scenarios than static sets. I think static sets have their value in different ways, but I think the main objective or the main advantage to that is being able to inventory very, 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 very fast and very effectively or efficiently, where you're not going to get that same information that fast or as efficient on a dynamic set. You have multiple trails. You're not going to cover every single trail with trail cameras. So you're going to have missed pictures. So it might take you a longer period of time for that deer to use that specific trail that you're watching. But in a hunting, as whitetail hunters, I think that there's more information gained through dynamic sets because you're able to pinpoint and narrow things down on a tighter basis when you get that information. And if you're take that a step further, if you're trying to target a specific animal, you want to gain as much specific information as possible, and you're not going to do that with static sets. You're going to do it with dynamic sets.
Yeah, especially over a mineral pile, food pile, more than likely on most farms across America, for sure.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, that's helpful. Any other best practices? Well, actually, let me ask you this before I ask you that. Where does the render fall into dynamic sets? Because I know we talked about it with statics, like all cell cams are not created equal.
Yeah.
How are you using renders in dynamic settings?
That's a good question. So when you look at, start comparing these specifications on cameras and kind of dictate whether or not they're built for static environments or dynamic environments, you're looking at the recovery time. You're looking at the video length that you can run. You're looking at the trigger delay, the minimum trigger delay, or the longest trigger delay. Like those are some of the core specifications you're looking at to kind of identify whether or not you can use them in static or in dynamic environments. When it comes to cell cameras, you can't really compare cell cameras to regular SD card cameras because the recovery time is always going to be longer because it's connecting to a physical network or the mobile network and uploading those photos. So when you're looking at cellular connected devices, you need to compare apples to apples. So it's cell cam versus cell cam. The render for a cell camera would be into that dynamic category. We're sitting here 2020. At one time, we had the fastest transmission and recovery time on the market with the render. And it's probably still true. I just don't want to say that in 2021 it still is true because I haven't really looked at some of the new products to market. But the render is definitely for a cell camera. It is in that dynamic category, especially with the new on-demand stuff that we're working on, where you have the ability to take pictures kind of live or videos live.
Yeah, I mean a cell camera on a dynamic set, that's what's killing your deer in real time. That combo right there, that is why the camera's built. That's why you use it. That's where the magic happens.
Yes.
Regardless of where you fall in the ethics. We talked about that on a different.
Yeah, but you can still. We have them on corn piles and bait sites here too.
Most of mine were on scrapes throughout the year.
Yeah, so I mean, you can still use them in that static environment, and they're going to perform just as well. You just have to watch your trigger delay, and that sort of thing. And there's another added layer to that with data. Like you don't want to hang that on a static set and then go through your month's data because there's 5 does eating out of a corn pile.
And then we get that question all the time. Is back when trade shows were a thing, the folks have like, well, what are the data plans? X amount for 500 pictures. Like, I get 500 pictures in a day. That's not really what that product was built for.
Right.
And so if anyone's listening to that now,
that's the thing. If you, Cameron and I talked about this, and because we have access to so many cameras, we're probably we run cameras a little bit different than what most people would.
Definitely.
But if you had a cell camera, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to set it in a bait station or corn pile
that you can check.
It doesn't, because you're going in there to put corn on the ground or fill a feeder up. So like the whole purpose of that is not to go in, not to lay your human footprint. So you'd want to move that back off that corn pile or off that feeder into more of a
where you think you can kill
sensitive location where you think you can kill that deer in the daylight.
There is an I will say there is an entertainment value of having it over that
oh, absolutely.
Food, like I like checking my deer pictures when I wake up just as much as the next guy. So there is value in that too. But so I respect that and I understand that. But when it comes down to the nitty gritty, that's not what it. Yeah.
Right.
Cell cameras, dynamic settings, real time data. Hopefully more buck tags filled.
And again, like if you're looking at cell cameras, if going back to those commodity cameras, you're not going to have the transmission speed. You're not going to have the customizable options. You may not have the app options to do different things inside the app.
HD image.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff there when you start looking at, our camera or Spartan versus, that $99 cell camera.
Yeah, they both have their place as always. I mean,
right.
Yeah. What's crazy as we talk about how, our platform's changed since we recorded this, how much has the industry, like the trail camera space, changed since then?
Oh, yeah.
A lot.
Yeah.
A lot.
Yeah.
Connected devices that are, not very expensive, and there was not a lot of those then. So it's just kind of interesting to see that evolution, and there's still going to be static cell cameras and dynamic cell cameras. This is the evolution of it.
Yep.
So anything else, any other parting words for dynamic sets?
No, I think, how you hang them and that spook equation that we talk about, that is still a major, major factor.
If not even more.
100%. Yeah, you still don't want those things noticeable, so you're still, going through the process of hiding that camera from side profile, the diameter of the tree, the height, all of that. When it comes to dynamic sets, it's really important that you have the height and the angle of that PIR sensor, that Fresnel lens, that detection zone kind of at the right height of a deer body where that deer is moving through that area. Because you get an edge of a food plot or a field or something, and that camera's too high and it's not angled down enough, you could be shooting over the top of the deer's back. The deer could be out there eating those beans or in that food plot, and you could never get a picture of him because, the sensor is not angled in a manner where you can detect anything. So I think when it comes to dynamic areas, that's very important that you have that on spot.
100% agree. Well, I felt like we covered this faster than last time, and that might be because it's more familiar with us. But anyways, hopefully everyone has a better understanding of what static sets are, dynamic sets, where they both have their place, what you need to shop for as you kind of fill those gaps for whatever scouting you're trying to do.
And they each have their place.
Yeah, absolutely.
They each have their place.
Yep. I think static sets are probably a little more heavy in the summer and postseason.
Yep.
Or late, and when it comes down to the heat of the moment, that's the madness that we all wait for, and those dynamic sets come into hand. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this. If you did, if you're watching on YouTube, a thumbs up. If you're listening to it, we don't. You know how many times we get approached like, "Hey, can we run ads on your podcast? Can we give you this? Can we give you that?" And we say, no. This is just for our viewers. This is our platform to educate folks. So all I'm asking is for a written review. That's what it really comes down to. If you want to keep not hearing any ads on here, man, it's the only way we reach more people. But really, also just sending it to someone. I don't know how many podcasts I listen to. It's because someone else posted on their Instagram story or like, "Hey, you got to listen to this episode," and enjoyed it. So beyond leaving a written review, to send it to someone that might enjoy this or learn something, that's just as valuable as well. So until next time, anything else?
That's it. We'll see you guys next time.